The year is 1453. You are a young mother in Constantinople, a city that for 1,000 years had stood as the bulwark of Christendom, its colossal Theodosian walls defying wave after wave of invaders. But now, the unthinkable is happening. Ottoman cannons, massive bronze monsters cast by Hungarian engineers, shake the earth with each thunderous strike. The walls that seemed eternal are crumbling stone by stone. Your husband, one of the defenders, fell 3 days ago on the ramparts, pierced by an Ottoman arrow. His body lies somewhere beneath the shattered battlements. Now, as the city's final defenses collapse, Turkish soldiers pour through the gates. Their shouts echo in the narrow streets. You clutch your infant daughter, the last fragment of your old life, and hear them battering at your door. You know what comes next, and in a moment of clarity, you realize his death may have been a mercy compared to what awaits you. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire expanded with dazzling speed, stretching across 3 continents. They are remembered for architectural marvels, the soaring minarets of the Blue Mosque, the intricate mosaics of Topkapi Palace. Their military brilliance shaped the destiny of Europe and the Middle East. To many, they embody glory, grandeur, and unstoppable power. But history often hides its most uncomfortable truths. Beneath the surface of triumphal chronicles lies another Ottoman story, one preserved not only in whispered chronicles of the defeated, but chillingly in the empire's own records. These were not accidents of war, not spontaneous outbursts of soldiers in victory. They were policies, systematic, deliberate, coldly calculated. When Constantinople fell on May 29, 1453, the city did not descend into random chaos. What unfolded was a machine set into motion, a process so organized it bore all the marks of official procedure. The Ottomans called it the harvesting protocol. Byzantine survivors described scenes like nightmares. Ottoman administrators, on the other hand, described them in ledgers, inventories, and manuals, as though they were balancing accounts in a marketplace. This was conquest elevated to bureaucracy. Death, enslavement, and terror were not side effects of war. They were the point. And what happened in Constantinople became the model for how the Ottomans would dominate the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. The story you are about to hear is not about battles, sultans, or palaces. It is about what happened to ordinary people when an empire perfected the art of conquest, not just over land, but over human bodies, souls, and generations yet unborn. When an Ottoman army breached the gates of a city, what followed was not the chaotic frenzy of soldiers running wild. It was something far more chilling: order. Victory triggered a system, refined over decades, known in Ottoman military records as the harvesting protocol. It was as bureaucratic as it was brutal conquest, turned into a process, one step following another with the precision of an accountant's pen. The first stage was elimination. Adult males over the age of 12 were rounded up and executed. These were not spontaneous massacres but organized killings, conducted in groups, often after surrender had already been secured. The Ottomans understood that even young boys, if left alive, could one day rise to challenge them. Those deemed promising in strength or spirit, sometimes as young as 6, were killed on the spot. The purpose was not military necessity, it was the prevention of memory, the erasure of potential resistance before it could even begin. But while men faced death, women and children were subjected to something that the empire considered more valuable than execution: processing. Ottoman soldiers and officials swept through the city's squares, herding the population into makeshift camps. Families were forced together at first, before being torn apart in full view of one another. Mothers clutching infants were separated from older children, daughters wrenched away, husbands already slain. The message was unmistakable. The empire did not just conquer bodies, it conquered bonds. Survivors described the atmosphere as almost ceremonial. Public squares, often still smoldering from fires, became stages of humiliation. Religious relics, torn from churches, lay scattered underfoot as Ottoman officials carried out the sorting. The empire was waging psychological warfare as much as military conquest. To witness one's family dismantled like livestock was to crush the will of entire communities in a single afternoon. It is here, in Constantinople's ruins, that we see the machinery of empire revealed in its most naked form. This wasn't plunder born of greed. This was statecraft. Human beings were resources divided, categorized, inventoried, and redistributed with ruthless efficiency. Within 48 hours of the city's fall, tens of thousands of people had been processed. Men lay dead in heaps beyond the walls. 12,000 women and girls were marked for shipment. 8,000 more were handed out to soldiers as rewards of conquest. In Ottoman eyes, this was not atrocity. It was administration. And it was only the beginning. For once the living had been sorted, the empire's records show, they became entries and ledger's entries that would fuel a system stretching across continents. The Ottomans had perfected the art of psychological warfare. For them, conquest was not complete when a city fell, it was complete when the survivors were broken. That meant not just killing, but killing with deliberate spectacle. Adult men, gathered in groups, were executed in open view. The method varied: beheading, strangulation, impalement, but the message remained constant. Defiance ended in annihilation. Boys considered strong enough to one day take up arms were slaughtered alongside their fathers. Even children were not spared if they carried the spark of resistance in their eyes. But death was only half of the machinery. The other half was separation. Families were not simply dismantled, they were dismantled publicly, piece by piece. A mother might be forced to watch her teenage son dragged to the execution field, while her daughter was herded into another line marked with chalk symbols on wooden boards. Infants were ripped from their mother's arms, sometimes killed instantly, not because the Ottomans feared the child, but because the sight of such cruelty shattered maternal resistance. Byzantine chroniclers wrote of women collapsing as soldiers pried children from their arms, their cries rising above the smoke of still-burning churches. But Ottoman documents describe these same scenes with chilling detachment. Women and children were divided into categories, each given a numeric designation. No names, no identities, only age, condition, and value. The most prized were young women, roughly between 14 and 25 AD. Ottoman records from Constantinople list over 4,000 in this category alone, each noted with a price range as if they were silk or spice. Those considered past their prime, women between 25 and 40, were assigned to labor. The elderly, those over 40, were deemed unprofitable. Many were executed on the spot. What strikes modern readers most is the cold precision. These were not wild atrocities in the chaos of conquest, but carefully ordered processes. The Ottoman chroniclers did not try to hide them. They preserved the details in ledgers and manuals. To them, this was administration, not crime. This industrial approach to human life was not unique in history. The Romans, too, had their slave markets, and the Mongols their infamous massacres. But the Ottomans elevated it to a science. The city was not just conquered, it was audited. Its people became entries in an imperial spreadsheet of blood and bone. And from these inventories flowed the next stage: transport and resale. What the empire called redistribution, but what the survivors experienced as the dismantling of their entire world. Once the sorting was complete, the next phase began: transport. To the Ottomans, human beings were not captives to be temporarily held. They were commodities destined for markets, spread across an empire. Within days of Constantinople's fall, caravans of chained women and children were marched to the docks. There, ships waited, not war galleys, but vessels built with cargo holds designed specifically for transporting human lives. Maritime archaeology reveals chilling details: ventilation shafts, water barrels, and crude waste systems installed to keep the cargo alive just long enough to reach the markets. Mortality rates averaged 15%. For Ottoman administrators, this was considered an acceptable loss, no different from spoiled grain or damaged timber. Women who died were thrown into the sea, their absence recorded as neatly as any other missing item on a shipping manifest. The ledgers survive. They read like grotesque shopping lists: 20 bolts Damascus silk, 40 sacks of pepper, 15 females aged 16-20, excellent condition. Not even the dignity of names, only numbers, ages, and market value. This was dehumanization by design, reducing flesh and soul to units of trade. Upon arrival, the captives entered the sprawling slave markets of the Ottoman world. Istanbul, Bursa, Edirne cities, whose grandeur was built not just on trade in spices and textiles, but on human lives. Markets were carefully structured. Young Greek or Serbian women fetched the highest prices, often 20 to 30 silver pieces. African women were sold in different categories, valued differently based on skin tone, origin, and perceived strength. These markets operated with astonishing sophistication. Prices rose and fell depending on supply, demand, and even seasonal warfare. A major campaign in the Balkans could flood the market with captives, driving prices down. A lull in conflict meant scarcity, and scarcity drove up value. In every calculation, human beings were no more than fluctuating entries on an economic chart. For the women themselves, arrival at the market marked the beginning of a new cycle of humiliation. Stripped of clothing, inspected for health, paraded before buyers, every shred of individuality was stripped away. Those chosen for elite households were branded with ownership marks. Others were herded into brothels, farms, or construction projects. The empire did not waste what it had taken. The Ottomans did not invent slavery, but they industrialized it. They created an empire-wide infrastructure where human trade was as standardized as any other commodity. And in doing so, they transformed conquest into a business model, one that turned war itself into an engine of profit. For most empires, slavery existed in the shadows, tolerated but never openly celebrated. The Ottomans were different. They elevated it into the language of law. Exploitation was not a breakdown of order, it was order. Their legal codes, preserved in Ottoman archives, spell out rules that made rape into marriage, widows into spoils, and human ownership into a matter of property rights, as legitimate as land or livestock. One of the most striking examples was the concept of the war wife. When an Ottoman soldier killed an enemy in battle, the dead man's widow did not remain free. By law, she became the property of her husband's killer. The procedure was disturbingly bureaucratic. 3 witnesses had to confirm the claim, and the process had to occur within 72 hours. If another soldier challenged the claim, the dispute was settled in a military court, recorded like an argument over grazing land. Ownership, however, was only the beginning. The next step was transformation. A woman's identity had to be erased and remade to suit the empire. Names were stripped away, replaced with Turkish or Arabic ones that bore no resemblance to their origins. Conversion to Islam was mandatory, enforced through public ceremonies designed as acts of humiliation. Women were forced to spit on icons, burn sacred texts, or denounce their former faith in front of crowds. Those who refused faced escalating punishments, never so severe as to render them unprofitable, but brutal enough to crush resistance. What emerged was not just submission, but a systematic breaking of the self. A war wife was not only a slave or concubine. She was expected to embody her new identity, her old life obliterated so completely that even memory became dangerous. Ottoman legal codes reinforced this erasure, prescribing not only how women were to be claimed, but how they were to be integrated into the empire's fabric, as though their past had never existed. The cruelty was not only physical, but psychological. To stand in a public square and renounce your gods, to hear your own name replaced forever, to be forced into the arms of the man who killed your husband, this was conquest of the soul as much as the body. And this was not rare. It was common, repeated across hundreds of cities and villages, from the Balkans to Anatolia. To the Ottomans, this was not excess. It was law. A framework that legitimized violence, normalized exploitation, and turned the personal tragedies of thousands into the ordinary functioning of empire. Beyond the battlefield and the markets, the Ottoman system developed something even more chilling: dedicated facilities for reshaping human beings. These were not informal arrangements inside barracks or private estates. Archaeological excavations in cities like Bursa and Edirne reveal foundations of specialized complexes, conversion centers designed to process women on an industrial scale. Inside these walls, identity itself was dismantled. New captives were stripped of possessions, names, and even clothing. Then began a carefully staged program of indoctrination. Religious instruction was combined with psychological torment. Women forced to desecrate sacred objects, to chant prayers they did not believe, to repeat new names until their old ones vanished from memory. Guards and clerics worked hand in hand, ensuring that resistance was broken not with chains alone, but with ritual humiliation that cut to the spirit. But these centers served another purpose: reproduction. Ottoman administrators understood that pregnancy could be used as a weapon of control. Captive women were systematically raped, not in secrecy, but as part of the program. 6 months was the standard duration of training, long enough to ensure many were carrying children by the time their conditioning ended. A child bound them irrevocably to their captors, erasing hopes of return to their former lives. The empire treated this process with the cold detachment of science. Surviving registers track fertility rates, miscarriages, and birth outcomes as if they were agricultural reports. Physicians were employed not to care for the women's health, but to maximize success. A healthy pregnancy meant a productive outcome. A miscarriage meant wasted investment. Human misery was calculated in the language of efficiency. The children born in these facilities faced predetermined fates. Boys were often removed at the age of 5 or 6, funneled into the Decomposition system to be remade as janissaries or administrators, loyal only to the Sultan. Girls were assessed for beauty and strength, some destined to repeat their mother's fate as part of the breeding cycle. Others disappeared into household labor or regional markets. For the mothers, the trauma was doubled. To endure systematic violation was one thing. To watch the empire seize the child, born of it, was another. Their despair became another layer of control. A calculated psychological weapon. Ottoman officials understood this well. A woman who believed her family ties had been permanently severed was far less likely to resist. What emerged from these centers was not simply a population of slaves. It was a generation stripped of memory, reshaped into tools of empire, proof that conquest did not end when a city fell. It continued in the hidden chambers where lives were remade, one broken spirit at a time. For the Ottomans, terror was not an accident of war, it was a strategy, sharpened into one of their most effective weapons. Word of what had happened in Constantinople spread quickly, not through rumor alone, but through deliberate design. Captives released as witnesses, traveling merchants, and even Ottoman chroniclers carried tales of cities emptied, women processed like livestock, and children torn from their mothers' arms. These stories did the work of cannons, breaking resistance before a single shot was fired. Entire villages, hearing what had befallen their neighbors, surrendered the moment Ottoman banners appeared on the horizon. Better to open their gates than risk annihilation. Yet surrender offered little mercy. Even populations that submitted voluntarily often found themselves subjected to the same protocols: sorting, separation, enslavement. Compliance was no shield against exploitation. It merely made the process smoother for the empire's administrators. The tribute system formalized this on a massive scale. The Decomposition levy is infamous for taking Christian boys from their families, raising them as janissaries and administrators loyal only to the Sultan. Less remembered, but equally harrowing, was the parallel levy imposed on girls. Young daughters were seized from villages under the same legal framework. But unlike the boys, whose education might lift them into positions of imperial power, the fate of girls was almost always sexual exploitation, domestic servitude, or reproductive slavery. Ottoman records, preserved in fragments, reveal staggering mortality. Nearly 40% of girls taken in tribute died within their first year in captivity, casualties of abuse and despair. The survivors entered breeding programs where pregnancies, births, and lifespans were tracked with the same precision used for livestock. Doctors recorded fertility cycles, guards calculated useful years, and administrators optimized population management. The horror lies not only in the brutality, but in the cold logic that governed it. To the Ottomans, terror was mathematics. Too much slaughter risked depopulating useful provinces, too little risked rebellion. The solution was a rhythm of fear and survival, fine-tuned by centuries of practice. This system reshaped entire societies. Families in the Balkans scarred their daughters' faces, or broke their teeth to make them less desirable to raiders. Villages built hidden chambers beneath homes, tunnels in forests, and mountain refuges. But Ottoman scouts adapted, using torture to uncover hiding places. Strategies of survival became traps. The result was a culture of permanent dread, where parents harmed their own children in the desperate hope of sparing them worse. Fear became self-perpetuating. Even before the army arrived, the empire had already won. When we step back and look at the Ottoman conquest not through battles and treaties, but through the machinery of human exploitation, a darker legacy emerges. This was not the chaos of war, nor the excesses of undisciplined soldiers. It was empire by design. Policies written into law, recorded in ledgers, and carried out with bureaucratic precision across 6 centuries. Entire societies were forced to adapt to the constant threat. In the Balkans, folk songs, prayers, and whispered tales carried warnings to future generations, reminders of what awaited if resistance failed. Parents scarred their daughters, families hid in mountain caves, villages created elaborate rituals of protection. These were not superstitions. They were survival strategies, etched into culture by centuries of trauma. The Ottoman chroniclers, far from ashamed, often wrote of these practices with pride. To them, the terror was not a stain but a tool, proof of imperial strength. They understood what modern historians often hesitate to acknowledge, that fear itself was a weapon, more effective than any cannon or cavalry charge. To make a city surrender without a fight saved lives, resources, and money, at least for the conquerors. For the conquered, surrender only meant that their torment began earlier. What makes this history so unsettling is not only the cruelty, but the normalization. Exploitation was made ordinary. Birth registers, slave inventories, medical notes on pregnancy cycles. These were the paperwork of empire, the same as tax rolls or trade receipts. In treating human beings as entries in ledgers, the Ottomans created a system where atrocity became administration. And yet, the traces remain. In the languages of borderlands, in the customs of families that once lived under the shadow of the crescent banner, in the silence surrounding vanished daughters and unnamed sons. Trauma leaves fingerprints, even when archives grow dusty. This is the legacy of the system, not only the architectural wonders or military triumphs that draw visitors today, but the invisible inheritance of fear and loss that shaped millions of lives. An empire does not endure for 6 centuries by swords alone. It endures by mastering the conquest of memory, of family, of hope itself. To study these records is to confront a truth that civilized societies often avoid, that the greatest horrors are not born in chaos, but in order. When cruelty is legalized, when bureaucracy gives structure to violence, when the destruction of families is treated as paperwork, then empire becomes not just a conqueror of lands, but a re-engineer of humanity itself.